The issue of private health insurance, and I'm joined from Melbourne by Terry Barnes, who's a health expert, former advisor to the Howard government on the health policy. Thanks for joining us again, Terry. The government, rightly I suppose, touting this, Health Minister Greg Hunt touting the latest increase in private health insurance premiums that he's approved at just under 3%, saying it's the lowest increase in 3 years, but we've got the lowest rate of inflation. The lowest increase in 19 years, but we've never had inflation this low either. So it's all about the relationship to inflation, surely.
Well, it's actually about the relationship between the health insurance premiums and the costs of the claims that they pay out, and that's the real issue here. Health cost inflation in terms of hospitals, in terms of doctors, prostheses and all the other bits and pieces that health funds do cover. The average inflation rate for them is around 5 to 6%, which is explaining why they're always on the unpopular side of the fence when it comes to premium changes every year. But having said that, this year they tried for an average of 3.5%. Greg Hunt beat them down by to just under 3%. So the minister is taking credit for that, but it is actually the lowest average increase in 20 years, as Greg Hunt said. But you have to bear in mind it's an average. So some funds have a rate increase as low as just under 2% and others are close to 6%. So you have to look across the spread.
Sure, but what's inflation now? At about 2%? I mean, it's still above inflation. It's still a real increase in our costs.
Well, that's right. But as I said, I mean, you have to actually attack the causes of the health insurance premium cost increases, which are the cost of the services they buy. And unless you can get some real agreement in the private health sector about how to drive those prices down and keep them under control, we're actually not going to go anywhere in the longer term. Greg Hunt's doing a great job in terms of reforming what is able to be covered, particularly around hospital in the home and mental health services. Keeping people out of hospital is actually probably the most cost-effective way of doing things, but it's not enough. You actually have to understand that people don't want to buy private health insurance if they can avoid it, and to make it more than a grudge purchase, you really have to attack the quality of the product and its price, but also the range of services that it pays for. Are we actually paying for too much as well as paying too much?
Yeah, well, this gets to the issue of the gap, right? I mean, it's just so frustrating when you make that commitment to pay private health insurance. It's not cheap. And then, of course, when you need services, you're hit with an additional cost. I mean, if you can get rid of that gap payment, people would be much happier about the insurance they pay.
Well, that's true, but I think we've got to be fair here. I think most people, when they use their private insurance, don't get hit by a surprise gap because their health fund actually plays a difference between what they give a doctor and Medicare. But there are those small percentage of doctors who don't give a stuff about what the health fund pays or what the person can afford, who just charges what they like, and we don't need to mention names. And they're the ones who give the whole industry a bad name, and they're the ones who give the private health choice a bad name. And if people are actually cheesed off with those types of experiences, they're going to leave. They're going to rely on the public system, and that's exactly what the government, what the private health sector and certainly insurers don't want.
Well, this is there's a bit of a sort of ideological contest here as well, where certainly people on the coalition side would want to see an increase, always want to increase the number of people who are paying private health insurance, try and boost the private health sector to keep people off the public system, where there's a lot of people on the left of politics, some in Labor, who would argue that it'd be better if we're all in the public system, like the British National Health Scheme. Are we ever going to come to a resolution there about actually how we want the health system to look?
Well, I think between the two parties, both of them have accepted that the private health sector and private health insurance have a role. I think the Labor Party reluctantly and the coalition very willingly. But look, I think the problem for me, Chris, is that when we talk about the private health sector, it's usually just about private health insurance. We don't get to really get some change here, you have to get some consensus, you have to get some understanding and some common will between the doctors, the hospitals, manufacturers of prostheses and, of course, the insurers. None speak for the rest, and that's part of the problem. If you looked at the National Press Club debate last week between Stephen Duckett of the Grattan Institute, Tony Bartoni of the AMA and Rachel David of Private Health Australia, they're all sort of spruiking their own interests. They weren't sort of saying, well, let's work together, let's actually get a common position and take that to the government and take that to the Australian public. They're all defending their own patches and saying, oh, look, all the problems with private health are actually everybody else's fault but not ours. And until we can get past that, until I think the industry itself actually realises, the private health insurance industry, when they talk about premium increases, realises that they have to actually lead the debate and not respond to it as they've been responding to Stephen Duckett, effectively by pulling out from their filing cabinet 20 years ago old policy reports and refreshing them. We're not going to get that.
It all gets so complex, and I think they feed off the complexity. I had some dental work done on Friday. It cost an enormous amount. You whack it on the credit card, but I've got, you know, private dental cover, but no, they don't pay for anything. I need to contact my insurer and find out what's going on, whether I should be getting some money there. But, you know, who's got the time to chase all this stuff down? I mean, in the end, we've got to get more simplicity into the system, but as you keep saying, reduce the costs. How does a government force the private sector to reduce those costs?
Well, I think, as I say, I think it's got to force the private health sector as a whole to work together and not work against each other, because it's much easier to sell reform politically if you know that you've got the backing and not got the vested interest sniping at each other. But beyond that, look, I think the most important thing they can do, and I banged on about this with you before, is dealing with those really bad, egregious out-of-pocket costs. Now, I think Greg Hunt has announced a website, a voluntary website as far as the doctors is concerned, to indicate what likely out-of-pockets will be. But I think you need more than that. I think you really need to take to it with an axe and really take it up to those greedy doctors who, as I say, give the whole sector and the whole private health choice a bad name. And I think there are ways and means of doing that, particularly in the government has leverage with its Medicare provider numbers, for instance. Why should a doctor who is a constant greedy biller have access to a Medicare provider number and therefore a licence to print money?
Fair point. Fair question. Thanks for joining us again, Terry.